People remember NASA as the driving force of the space age, but that bold mid-century vision of lunar colonies and Mars missions, they failed to materialize.
And the reason that NASA couldn't do it is not that there was any kind of problem with the technology. It's that, as is always the case with government attempts at productive enterprise, there are always inefficient failures. They never deliver on their promises. It's inherent in the nature of this kind of system.
The driving of the private industry in space, it's driven by entrepreneurs that have succeeded and failed towards their success before they succeeded and built their wealth in other industries. It's not just scientists.
The kind of thinking that makes that possible is not just what does the physics allow us to create given unlimited resources. It's how do we integrate what we know how to do from the physics with the state of our knowledge about how to produce things. And that's what people in technology entrepreneurship are particularly good at, is simultaneously thinking about what does it take to produce things versus what is physically possible to build.
Since Neil Armstrong's giant leap in 1969, visions of lunar colonies and crewed Mars missions captured the public imagination, only to stall just 3 years later as NASA's achievements lost momentum. For over 4 decades, government-led programs struggled under budget cuts, shifting priorities, and risk aversion, leaving the promise of a routine space travel seemingly out of reach. Recently, however, achievements like SpaceX's catching the giant Starship by what we call chopsticks, colloquially, and civilian missions like Blue Origin's New Shepard program, that turned these unimaginable feats into just another day in office almost. These achievements reignited humanity's celestial ambitions. But how did we get here? Why the progress was so slow? What caused the recent acceleration? And what can understanding the development of space industry teach us about progress more broadly? Are the questions we will discuss today on Ayn Rand Institute's podcast. I'm Robertas Bakula, and with me today is Mazza, an author of the forthcoming essay exploring how freedom, not just funding art or just technology, has sparked a new space renaissance. The questions that we'll be tackling in today are the questions that Mike will discuss in much more detail in the essay, but this is a good preview who want to see it early. So Mike, let's start with the big picture. For decades after Apollo, an event that Ayn Rand wrote in one of my favorite essays of hers called Apollo 11, progress in space exploration seemed to stall. People remember NASA as the driving force of the space age, but that bold mid-century vision of lunar colonies and Mars missions, they failed to materialize, it seems. So what happened in your review? What were the main factors that led to stagnation under NASA's leadership? And how did that affect our expectations about space until today?
So I think it's important to always emphasize in this, when asking this question about space technology, the key role space launch capacity plays in the entire industry. So whether we're asking about scientific missions to other planets, space stations, lunar colonies, lunar exploration, the main piece of infrastructure that makes all these kind of missions possible is the capacity to get mass off the surface of the Earth and into orbit. And that has been until the 1980s, as we'll talk about, that has been the exclusive domain of government entities to own and operate launch vehicles. So in the wake of Apollo, there's about a 15-year period where there's no lunar kind of interest in lunar or planetary exploration by human beings. What there is interest in learning about human survival in space. So one of the actual accomplishments of NASA in the 70s is just kind of ironing out what it takes for long-term human presence in orbit. So the things like see the space station astronauts like exercising and like how they exercise and what their diet consists in and how long they can stay up there and what they have to do to stay up there. That kind of knowledge was ironed out in the 70s, but there was no real progress in space launch technology. And my thesis in the article is that this stagnation is largely, or excuse me, not largely, entirely, the result of the fact that space launch was illegal to non-government entities. It was basically NASA and the military could operate space launch vehicles in the United States. Now, there were private aerospace companies designing these vehicles and providing service to them and expertise in all their operations, but they were owned and operated by various government, the Air Force and NASA. And we have the kind of progress we see currently because of the rapid development of specifically space launch technology. That is, rockets that can get things off of the Earth and into orbit. And the progress that matters most in that domain is you can boil it down to cost per unit mass to orbit. So the cheaper it is to get a pound of anything into orbit, the more things you can put in orbit, the less expensive those things become. So if it's really expensive, tens of thousands of dollars to get a pound of mass to orbit, then it's going to be in the interest of whoever is sending that up there to use exotic ultralight materials. There's constraints in the volume of things you can put up there because the casing of the rocket is a piece of mass that you have to take into account too. So that restrains how large a rocket could be, like, volumetrically. And what private industry has done, specifically first SpaceX and now Rocket Labs and Blue Origin, and ULA also, has driven the cost of mass to orbit down orders of magnitude. So for the space shuttle program, there's conflicting estimates, but it's in the tens of thousands of dollars per pound of mass to orbit. I've seen estimates from NASA that's in the $50,000, $60,000 per pound range. And I mean, part of the how shocking that is that it's actually a step in the wrong direction from earlier rocketry. So the estimates of the price of mass to orbit for the Saturn V rocket is something like $5,000 per pound. So it's a kind of 10x increase in the space shuttle. And so that whole era was not just mere stagnation. It was, I think it did a lot of damage to the space launch industry, or the space industry more broadly, because one of the things that came out of that, so there's one, it's illegal to have private space launch. So there's not really any market experimentation. There's just whatever someone could convince NASA to experiment on, and that's your only hope. But it's not just that there's no progress, it's that there's a kind of regression in thinking about things. So at the start of the space shuttle program, the idea was that, as Richard Nixon put it, we'd take the astronomical cost out of astronomical exploration. And the idea was that we'd do this by having reusable spacecraft. So the space shuttle was supposed to be, and sort of was reusable, semi-reusable. Sometimes it's refurbishable, but not exactly reusable. That program increased the cost of reaching space. And it did so while trying to pioneer reusability technology. So one of the kind of cultural takeaways of that is maybe reusability isn't so important for lowering costs of space exploration. And I think that explains a lot of the choices NASA made over the years, like in the wake of this space shuttle program. What programs got funded versus how the current SLS rocket program is going. If the takeaway is that reusability is not as important for lowering costs as was once thought, well, then you're not going to make any progress in lowering costs to orbit, because as we now know, thanks to SpaceX, Blue Origin, and new entrants, is that it was true the whole time that reusability is the key to lowering the cost of accessing lower Earth orbit. And the reason that NASA couldn't do it is not that there was any kind of problem with the technology. It's that, as is always the case with government attempts at productive enterprise, there are always inefficient failures. They never deliver on their promises. This is inherent in the nature of this kind of system. You think about the post office or nationalized industries. All of these things, they, even if they can kind of do what they're supposed, like the mail actually gets to your house, they don't do it as well as we now see UPS and Amazon delivery and all that. Like those are much better than the USPS. The USPS used to be worse when it was more of a government-controlled entity. Now it's a kind of quasi-private thing that has to be self-funding, sort of. So these things are always, like, at their best, they kind of scrape by. So in kind of hindsight, like, yeah, of course it was going to be this way. But this fact that NASA had a monopoly or a near monopoly on space launching in the United States, I think, is responsible for 30 or 40 years of just lost time in the development of space technology. And I think a good illustration of this is there was a lot of fanfare 15 years ago when the first vertically landing rockets started to come into existence. SpaceX and Blue Origin each were experimenting with these vertically landing rockets. And that's 2013, 2014, somewhere around then. But the first vertically launching and vertically landing rocket was McDonnell Douglas's Delta Clipper program. You can find the old videos on YouTube. That it achieved the first powered vertical landing in 1993. So that kind of technology was possible at least as late as 1993, if not earlier. And that's in the context of, well, it's all of the private aerospace companies have basically two customers, the defense industry and NASA. And that was technologically possible in the early 90s. NASA eventually canceled the program after they took it over in favor of other space planes that never materialized, kind of successor space planes to the shuttle. So there's just a whole, 3 or 4 decades of time where, had there been freedom to launch in the space industry, that is, freedom to develop, operate, own, and use it according to, the developer's best judgment, those kind of vehicles, there was a lot of innovation that's just left on the table. So what we get now are rockets that autonomously land or are caught by towers, as you mentioned, the SpaceX Starship booster, and none of that would have been possible earlier, just because of how much computation it takes to do those sort of things. But there's a kind of middle sort of technology that could have been explored and we could have all benefited from, that just never materialized because it was illegal.
So what changed then? Like now we see all those private companies, including SpaceX, including Blue Origin, breaking frontier. Almost every year there is an incredible achievement, and we lose our minds about how crazy it is, and then it becomes routine until a new achievement hits us again. Blue Origin Rocket Lab is another company. They're making headlines and rapid advances, and the costs are going down. So if it was not some sudden breakthrough in technology, as you mentioned, something changed politically in the last 20 years to make this private boom possible?
Yeah. So during the Reagan administration, there was in a 1984 act, the Commercialization of Space Launch. Commercial Space Launch Act is the title. It took me a second to remember. And in that act, it legalizes the launch of spacefaring vehicles by private companies. So it's pretty explicit in the only grounds on which the government, including regulatory bodies, can restrict private launches are safety and national security. Now, during that same period of time was the sort of heyday of the space shuttle program. So even though commercial space launching became legal, NASA used the space shuttle program to kind of crowd out competition by deeply subsidizing the cost of launch. So there's some documents and research I quote in my article about what NASA was charging, to launch a payload to space on the space shuttle versus the actual cost. And the actual cost was something like at least twice, if not 3 times more than the price they were charging. So there's a kind of intentional crowding out, I think, of competition during that period of time. And it's only until the Challenger disaster grounds the space shuttle program that in 1990, Congress passes the Launch Service Purchase Act that starts to require government agencies that are in need of space launch to contract or to take bids from private launch companies. And then you have Boeing and Lockheed Martin start to provide some launch services to government entities. Boeing and Lockheed Martin's launch programs eventually are encouraged by the government to merge into one, and that's what ULA is today. So that's it's during that period of the mid 80s to the early 90s that you see actually the first private launch companies enter the market, and it's the traditional aerospace players. Now, the presence of NASA in the market, I think, had a kind of intimidation effect on what we call space startups, as opposed to like Boeing and Lockheed Martin are established aerospace companies entering the launch market versus just straight up launch startup like we see now. It's these companies that are the exciting ones. And just to give one example, there was a company, Beale Aerospace, that was founded in the 90s. And it was possible to found it because, well, launches had become legal a few years earlier, and there was now the possibility of winning government contracts through the Launch Service Purchase Act. So there was some clear market there. Beale Aerospace was founded in the mid to late 90s, but it closed up in the early 2000s, I think 2003. And the reason they stated why are we closing was, well, the new replacement for the space shuttle program, a space launch system, was announced. And their attitude was, look, we don't know how to interpret this because NASA has a track record of deeply subsidizing space launch when they're, they have their own system. They'll offer it at deeply subsidized prices. So like they used to be offering it at like half the cost of the space. Could they offer it lower? And like, can we compete with that? We don't even know. Now, in hindsight, that turned out to be wrong, because in 2002 and then I think it's 2004, Blue Origin and then SpaceX were founded, and they didn't have that problem. But that's hindsight. You don't know at the time. A lot of the land that SpaceX uses in Texas, they bought from Beale Aerospace. I think that's where some of their test facilities came from. So it's not really until the 2004, the 1998 Commercial Space Act and the 2004 amendment to the Commercial Space, the original 84 Act, there's really a lot more, not just permission, but clarity to what space launch companies can do and what they can kind of anticipate from NASA and government space launch programs. And then after that, you get this kind of emerging space launch industry, SpaceX and Blue Origin, the first two. I think the final relevant kind of piece of the puzzle is how ULA's monopoly on government contracts was broken. So ULA was formed, as I said, out of Boeing and Lockheed Martin's space launch companies or space launch services. And they effectively were the only entity that was being awarded military contracts for space launch services. And that's a very lucrative market. So here you have, well, the new entrants, Blue Origin and SpaceX, aren't able to get these contracts, and they have to compete with a company that's getting all this, revenue stream from these contracts. So there's a market, but it's an unnaturally unfair market because the ULA has special privileges. So SpaceX sued the Air Force, saying that they were unjustly excluding them from bidding on military contracts. And the Air Force dropped the requirement, and SpaceX dropped the lawsuit. So that's when you finally see these open biddings on government contracts for launch services. It's a major new revenue stream for all the startups, the military contracts. And then now we're kind of in the wake of all of that. We're seeing all of these new companies are, of course, privately funded investment, and then they're being awarded military contracts. And as we'll talk about, they're also being awarded NASA contracts. So there's a kind of open market in these services. And I think that's what's really important, is that this took about 20 years, but this expansion of freedom in space launch, in the space launch market.
Okay, so now I have a question that's not only, I think, alive as in our audience, but really alive in my mind too. So government contracts and the NASA's involvement, even if we sort of take your claim that it was the NASA's monopoly and a lot of the failures of their decisions and how they run it that led to the stagnation, and then the changes to sort of allow more freedom in the market that furthered the boom. Critics could easily say, even now, and in the description that you just gave about government contracts and the access to government contracts to new private companies, that those companies relied heavily on the government funding and infrastructure to be able to develop their programs. So in 2008, NASA awarded SpaceX $1.6 billion contract to deliver supply missions to International Space Station, and contracted SpaceX to take astronauts to ISS. Blue Origin received money, $181 million, I think, by U.S. Air Force to develop their New Glenn launch program. And that's just a few examples. There's others with a little lower amounts. But it seems that those are significant contracts that were important both for SpaceX that it sued for and wanted to get for its development. So how do you think then how do you think about the relationship between public agencies and private enterprises, and the impact that the military contracts and government and NASA's contracts have for these companies? Aren't they essential to the development?
Yeah, so let's start by separating out military contracts with NASA contracts. So I think there's an important difference here. Military functions are legitimate functions of the state. Defense contracts are there's so long as those sort of contracts are not used to prop up privileged players, that is, they're not just in on paper, but in fact open to bidding and fair bidding and competition, and there's objective requirements for who's going to get a contract to develop something for the military. I think that's a completely legitimate market for a private space company to pursue. It's necessary to have a functioning cutting edge military, national defense purposes, all kind of telecommunication that the military and intelligence services need. That's all fine and great. And I think it's fantastic that we have companies like SpaceX, Rocket Labs, Blue Origins, and all the others that can provide that to the government. Again, the qualification on that is that it's actually open to any capable provider. It's not, a secret backdoor deal for a privileged player. So I think that's fantastic. Some people, I've read some people kind of talk about those as subsidies to the industry. I don't see them as any more subsidy than if the FBI buys a bunch of SUVs from Ford, that's a subsidy to Ford. The government needs to be able to buy things to function. And it's good that there's private companies that can provide those services. NASA, on the other hand, is not a proper function of the government. It's depending on what period of time you look at its mission and its actual activities, it's an exploratory organization like space exploration, or it's a scientific organization. We're going to send probes to other planets, or all three, or it's developing things that it sends to can be used by other parts of the government, rocket technology that can be used by the military or something. So it's kind of doing all these different things at different periods of time for different purposes. So I don't think that an organization like that in its current form, like NASA, should exist. There might be some role for something somewhat like NASA in a rights-respecting free society, where its purpose is like facilitating the government's agency in space, like the government's ability to operate in space. You might have an agency that does that. There might be something like that. But as a scientific research program, an exploratory program, I don't think that's a legitimate function of government. So the question is, should Blue Origin, SpaceX, and the rest take funding from those and contract with an organization like that? I would say ideally not. But depending on how they assess what they're doing, they might want to. It might be reasonable for them to do that. If they think of it as, this is a way for us to get back some loot, the NASA's taxpayer funded, and it's done a lot of damage to the space industry over time. So is this a way to get some kind of loot back? I mean, if that were the motivation of these companies, I think that would be fine. I don't think it is. Like, maybe in a few cases that Elon Musk sometimes says things like that. Not recently, but if you look at the way he talks about NASA 5 years ago, it's much more like they're a monopoly. They corrupted the industry. The effect of NASA on the private space industry now, I think, is distorting the market, not helping it. I think in the long run. So just for example, Musk and people at SpaceX have said publicly that they don't think the moon is that important. They're Mars focused. Yet they took a lot of money to develop a moon lander. So that's something they wouldn't have done if it weren't for they likely wouldn't have done if it weren't for NASA. It's not part of their Mars mission that there'll be a depot on the moon or anything like that. That's not how they're thinking about it. So there's a lot of distortion that NASA does in the space industry. But it's important to keep in mind that those are just the net NASA funding is just one revenue stream for these companies. It's not the sole revenue stream. At the early stages, SpaceX was funded by Musk's own money, plus some other private investors. Later, when it was near bankruptcy, I think it was Peter Thiel gave them or invested a substantial amount to keep them going. Blue Origin has a similar background. Jeff Bezos founded it, and he has deep pockets. So I don't think that any of that's necessary. That is, it's not like if it weren't for NASA's funding, these organizations wouldn't exist at all. I think they would just exist in different forms, and maybe more for something like Blue Origin. Maybe it might be a lot different for SpaceX, and probably would be a little different. So I think there's a distorting effect of NASA on the industry, but it's less and less, I think, as time goes on. For example, SpaceX is profitable now, and my understanding that what makes it profitable is its Starlink satellite program. It's providing internet service via satellite. Most of the other companies aren't profitable yet. Like Blue Origin, I don't think is profitable. But there's clearly a market here, and the investments are flowing in. And if it weren't for NASA, things would look different, but it would be, I think, fundamentally in the same direction, and so directionally identical.
So you partly addressed my next question, or a related question that I have in my mind, and it's by saying that there is clearly a market of which an example Starlink and internet provision is, and there's probably many more outcomes and technologies or services and products that come out of it. If you can say something more about those while you're answering this, there is a lot of sort of debate and criticism or question whether today's space race or the space industry is just a playground for billionaires and rich people. And the most salient example, I guess, in everybody's mind today is the high-profile flight of Blue Origin, the mission NS-31, all female crew. And the name that attracted the most attention was the singer Katy Perry, who was on board. And so the announced goals of that mission was, quote, challenge the crew's members' perspectives of Earth, empower them to share their own stories, and create lasting impact that will inspire people across our planet for generations. So there is not much there about technology, commerce, or scientific achievements or exploratory achievements. So how do you respond to the criticism that it is more of a spectacle rather than substance in private exploration?
In that particular case, it sounds like PR for a space tourism business. And I don't see anything wrong with that. Like, it's not like what inspires me about the space industry is not tourism, but there's not something wrong with tourism, and if they can generate a profitable service for wealthy people where they send them to space and they get to have this experience, eventually things like that wind up affordable to the middle class. It's a revenue stream for them. So I'm all in favor of it. Now the putting a pop singer up there is a little silly to me. It made more sense when they put up William Shatner because he was Captain Kirk from Star Trek. But if you're trying to expand excitement in space, that they have their strategy. We'll see. We'll see what comes of it. The other point is maybe that there was some drop of truth in it. That in the early days, this is a vanity project. It's Elon Musk, the billionaire, and Jeff Bezos, the billionaire, and that's all you hear about. That hasn't been true for a while. The space launch industry, all the newer startups, it's much more like the regular tech startup in field, which is that people with good ideas pitch them, get investors, and found companies. And there's a cool startup called Stoke Space, which is founded by former SpaceX engineers. And they got, they're not billionaires. They got investment from venture capital firms, and they have a new rocket company. And there's a number of places like that. There's probably more than we know about because they're not all, as public as they're not on Twitter all day like Elon Musk. So there's a whole industry here now. It's not just, we hear about Blue Origin and SpaceX in part because they've been around for so long and they're leading kind of leaders in the field. Also because of the celebrity of their founders. And also, especially in the case of SpaceX, just because of their success. So I don't think it's factually true anymore. And even if it were true, my reaction is so what? Jeff Bezos earned his fortune. Elon Musk earned his fortune, and this is what they want to do with it. We'll see if anything comes of it. Maybe they can make money. Maybe they can't. It seems like SpaceX is able to turn a profit now. Maybe Blue Origin will follow sooner than later. Maybe some of these other Stoke Space and Rocket Labs will be able to turn a profit too. But we'll just have to wait and find out.
That's important clarification. When I ask that question, I ask it as more of a devil's advocate of the question as it's usually asked now in the public forum. But yeah, even the assumption or the premise of the question that there is something wrong about billionaires who earned their wealth through value creation and the businesses like Amazon in Bezos's case, and then now are using that wealth to explore their dreams and their other achievements and pursue. It's like the premise of it, that there is something wrong with that, and they are supposed to serve somebody else and achieve and pursue goals that we the public or we the government decide them to pursue rather than the goals that they deem both ambitious and interesting. So the whole premise is wrong-headed, I think, but that qualification I think is important that you raised.
In this case, so there's kind of two things interacting. So one is the nihilistic hatred of billionaires. There's a resentment of the wealthy people, and this is one way it manifests. The other, there's another form of nihilism, which is the egalitarian hatred of technological progress. So that even though the Apollo program wasn't a billionaire vanity, whatever, there were people saying the same things, like, oh, look at all this wealth that's being wasted. It could be spent on the poorest of the poor and bringing up the third world or something. And people were saying that about the state sponsored program. So that kind of angle is more just, yeah, they want to tear everything down, whether it's a billionaire or whether it's the Apollo program. They just want to see us all, I don't know, live in caves, basically. So those kind of criticisms, my attitude is just expose them for what they are and then ignore them.
I agree. So let's talk a little more about, and this is sort of coming to my last and most important question. And I think what comes out in your forthcoming essay a lot is it is important that the driving of the private industry in space is done, it's driven by entrepreneurs that have succeeded and failed towards their success before they succeeded and build their wealth in other industries. And it's not just scientists and the bureaucrats in that sense. Now the entrepreneurs and the businessmen that have this attitude towards, like, we're looking at the market and we're trying to not just do it at whatever cost, but do it, explore the space and develop the technology in a way that gives us more value than we input in there, right? So this relationship between scientific thinking, scientific minds, and entrepreneurial thinking, which was the missing part while NASA had a monopoly. I assume you would say that about any other industry too, but can you elaborate a little more? What about entrepreneurial thinking is so important in this case? And what other examples, if you can come up with, that demonstrate this principle, that there are industries maybe that could benefit today or benefited in the history from the same kind of change of unleashing and allowing the entrepreneurs to bring in this business type perspective into to combine the scientific and technological achievements.
Yeah. So if what we're interested in is not what is something we have the know-how to build regardless of the cost, but if what you're interested in is technological progress, that is where some new creation actually makes the people who use it better off, and then if it's a kind of fundamental technology, makes the whole of the the whole of the world better off, then the kind of thinking that makes that possible is not just like, what does the physics allow us to create given unlimited resources? It's how do we integrate what we know how to do from the physics with the state of our knowledge about how to produce things. And that's what people in technology entrepreneurship are particularly good at, is simultaneously thinking about what does it take to produce things versus what is physically possible to build. And like I don't think it's accident that the two leaders in the kind of new industry are Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, who in different ways have expertise for Bezos, it's more supply chain and that kind of thing. For Musk, it's manufacturing. Like what he seems to really have a knack for is integrating product design with manufacturing capacity. And that is the kind of thing that you need to bring to bear on space launch to drive the cost down. And there's really interesting interviews. I think it's Jeff Bezos with Lex Frieden from 3 or 4 years ago, where he's talking about how Blue Origin is thinking about rocket reusability. And he's saying and emphasizing that we know the first stage in a multi-stage rocket, the best way to get the cost down is to make it reusable. But with the second stage, it's still more of an open question. Do we want to focus on really making the second stage as cheap to manufacture as possible with the expectation that it'll be destroyed in the process of using it? Or is it more economical to make it maybe more expensive to manufacture, but you can use it, dozens of times? And he said that's just an open question to them. Now, this is a couple of years ago. Maybe they've updated their thinking, but his answer is the only way we're going to solve that is people are going to have to do it, and we're going to just have to see what the outcomes of that are. And none of that's possible if you have a one actor launch economy, where that one launch provider isn't really getting its funding by making a successful service that people want to buy, but is getting it funding through the tax system. If Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or Rocket Labs or any of these, if they're wrong in their approach to space launch, they'll either have to change course, or they'll go bankrupt, or they'll be bought out by a better competitor. But if NASA is wrong about whether a space plane is better for reusability than a vertically landing booster, well, they can still get their, they just have to convince a politician. They don't have to sell anything to anybody. They can lobby for their increased funding. And I mean, when you take that perspective on them, then a lot of the things that they do that don't make any sense become intelligible. Like the space launch system rocket that's getting pressed for being too expensive and now finally probably will be canceled. It was mandated in the legislation that kind of started the program. It was mandated that that program use old shuttle parts and processes. So it's like this 21st century rocket is going to be built out of technology from the 70s and 80s that didn't actually accomplish its goal. Like, that's the plan. It's like a private industry would never do that. But that was NASA's approach. And why? Well, because getting funding is not about providing a product people want to buy and voluntarily invest in and hope to make a profit on. It's about convincing some politician or congressman to vote a certain way, to direct the loot from one thing to another thing, and that's how it goes. So if the question is what's made the current renaissance in space technology possible, it's that entrepreneurs were freed to do their work in the space launch industry. So you need the freedom and you need the entrepreneurs. And if you don't have the freedom, that doesn't matter how many there are in any other industry, you're not going to get the output.
So you definitely elaborate more on this relationship in the essay. And to wrap up, I want to recommend everyone to wait and subscribe to the New Ideal and click those buttons for notifications so that you know when the essay is coming out, and you can read more from the research and the thinking that Mike has done on the space exploration industry development. You can also watch another podcast episode of the Ayn Rand podcast where Mike Mazza and Tristan Gillies discussed space, the new commercial frontier. They went a little more into detail of history of full pedaling and what does the relationship between public agencies and private companies look like, and a little more into some legal developments of the industry. And finally, one resource we mentioned in this interview was Ayn Rand's essay Apollo 11, and I think it's a good example of one is how to marvel at some of the great achievements, technological achievements, while at the same time thinking carefully and philosophically of what about the costs and the meaning of the government's involvement and enforcement of those goals on the people who may not support those goals voluntarily. So if you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and click the bell to get the notifications. If you're watching the recording, please like, comment on it, share the episode to help attract viewers. Please consider doing the same on other platforms like Facebook. And if you have questions or comments about today's episode, or you have suggestions for future episodes, please send us an email at newideal@aynrand.org. We read all of your emails and reply to many. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Robertas.